The stories you are about to hear are based on real accounts from taxi drivers who worked the night shift in towns, cities, and back roads across the country. Some details have been changed for privacy. Others remain exactly as they were reported, no matter how disturbing. These tales are not for the faint of heart. If you've ever taken a late-night ride, you might want to think twice before hailing one again. Listener discretion is advised. Story 1. Route between AM and AM, and if a passenger disappears mid-ride, do not stop. I chuckled, thinking it was a local initiation prank, but the dispatcher's stern face suggested otherwise. He looked me in the eyes and said, "These rules are for your safety." I nodded, still skeptical, and began my shift. The town streets were deserted, and the silence was deafening. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching me. The air was thick, and the darkness seemed to have a life of its own. Little did I know the rules were not just guidelines, they were lifelines. Around AM, I received a call to pick up a passenger near the old mill on Route 1. Hesitated, recalling the rule about avoiding that route between AM and AM, but curiosity got the better of me, and I accepted the ride. As I approached the mill, a dense fog enveloped the road. Visibility dropped, and the headlights barely pierced the mist. A figure emerged from the fog, a woman in a white dress standing motionless by the roadside. I stopped, and she silently entered the back seat. Her face was pale and her eyes were hollow. She whispered an address I didn't recognize, and I began driving. The GPS couldn't locate the destination, but she insisted I continue. As we drove, the fog grew thicker and the road seemed unfamiliar. Suddenly the car's radio turned on, playing a distorted lullaby. The atmosphere inside the car became oppressive. The temperature dropped and my breath became visible. I glanced at the rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty. Panic set in, and I slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, and I turned around. Still no one there. I remembered the rule. If a passenger disappears mid-ride, do not stop. I had broken it. Suddenly the car's doors locked and the windows fogged up. A shadowy figure appeared outside, circling the vehicle. It tapped on the windows, whispering unintelligible words. I tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The figure's whispers grew louder, turning into screams. Desperate, I closed my eyes and recited a prayer. When I opened them, the fog had lifted and the figure was gone. The car started without issue, and I drove back to the dispatch center. The dispatcher looked at me, his face pale. "You broke the rule," he said. I nodded to shake and to speak. He handed me a small vial filled with a dark liquid. "Drink this before your next shift. It offers some protection." I took it, unsure of its contents. That night I couldn't sleep. The woman's hollow eyes haunted me. Realized Pine Hollow was no ordinary town. The next night I followed the rules meticulously. No hitchhikers, no route, and I drank the vial's contents before starting. The liquid tasted bitter, but I felt a warmth spread through me. Around AM, I received a call to pick up a passenger near the cemetery. I hesitated, but accepted, thinking the protection would help. At the cemetery, a man in a black suit waited. He entered the car silently and gave me an address. As we drove, he began humming a tune that sent chills down my spine. The road seemed endless and the surroundings unfamiliar. Suddenly, he stopped humming and said, "You've been marked." I looked at him, but his face had transformed into a grotesque mask. I swerved the car, trying to eject him, but he vanished. Returned to the dispatch center, trembling. The dispatcher was waiting, concern etched on his face. "The vial offers limited protection," he said. "You need to perform a cleansing ritual." He handed me a bundle of sage and a handwritten incantation. That night I followed the instructions, burning the sage and reciting the words. The air around me shimmered, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but I knew the town's darkness was far from gone. Each night brought new horrors, and the rules became my lifeline. I documented every experience, hoping to warn others. Pine Hollow was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and I was caught in its grasp. The next day, it was a moonless night in Pine Hollow, and the air was thick with an eerie silence. I had just finished a ride and was heading back to the dispatch center when my radio crackled to life. "Pickup needed at the old Jefferson Road," the dispatcher said. I hesitated, recalling the stories about that area, but duty called. As I approached the pickup point, I saw young woman standing alone, her eyes wide with fear. She quickly got into the back seat, whispering, "Please just drive." I didn't ask questions and started driving. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, and the darkness grew thicker. Suddenly, the temperature dropped and the windows fogged up. I glanced in the rear view mirror, but the back seat was empty. Panic set in, and I remembered the rule. If a passenger disappears mid-ride, do not stop. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept driving. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't. The dispatcher, a distorted voice, whispered, "Turn back." I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead. Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered and the engine sputtered. The vehicle came to a halt, and the darkness outside seemed to press against the windows. I tried to restart the engine, but it was dead. Tapping sound came from the passenger window. I turned to see the same woman, her face pale and eyes hollow. She mouthed the words, "Help me," before vanishing. The tapping continued now from all sides of the car. I was surrounded. Suddenly, the car's interior lights turned on, revealing handprints all over the windows. I remembered the vial the dispatcher had given me and quickly drank its contents. A warmth spread through my body, and the tapping ceased. The engine roared back to life, and I sped away from Jefferson Road, back at the dispatch center. The dispatcher looked at me with concern. "You encounter her, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded still. Shaken, he handed me a new set of rules, more detailed than before. "There's more you need to know," he said. I realized then that Pine Hollow held many secrets, and I was just beginning to uncover them. The town's darkness was deeper than I had imagined, and I was now a part of it. The following night, I was determined to adhere strictly to the rules as I drove through the desolate roads of Pine Hollow. My radio crackled to life. "Pick up at the old church on Miller's Road," the dispatcher announced. I hesitated, recalling the rule, avoid Miller's Road after midnight, but curiosity got the better of me, and I accepted the ride. The church stood isolated, its silhouette barely visible against the dark sky. A man in a tattered suit waited outside, his face obscured by shadows. He entered the taxi silently, and I began driving. The atmosphere grew tense, and an inexplicable chill filled the air. Suddenly the man spoke, his voice raspy. "Do you believe in redemption?" I glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but his seat was empty. Panic surged, and I remembered the rule. If a passenger disappears mid-ride, do not stop. I continued driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The radio emitted static, followed by a distorted voice whispering, "Turn back," ignoring it. I focused on the road ahead. Suddenly, the headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. The taxi came to a halt, and darkness enveloped me. A tapping sound echoed from the passenger window. I turned to see the man from earlier, his eyes glowing unnaturally. He mouthed the words, "Help me," before vanishing. The tapping intensified now, coming from all sides. I felt surrounded, the air thick with dread. Remembering the vial from the dispatcher, I quickly drank its contents. A warmth spread through me, and the tapping ceased. The engine roared back to life, and I sped away from Miller's Road, back at the dispatch center. Dispatcher awaited me, concern etched on his face. "You encountered another one," he stated. I nodded, still shaken. He handed me a new set of rules, more detailed than before. "There's more you need to know," he said. I realized then that Pine Hollow held many secrets, and I was just beginning to uncover them. The town's darkness was deeper than I had imagined, and I was now a part of it. Each night brought new horrors, and the rules became my lifeline. I documented every experience, hoping to warn others. Pine Hollow was a place where the veil between worlds was thin. Determined to understand the town's mysteries, I began researching its history. I discovered that Miller's Road was once the site of a tragic accident involving a church congregation. Their bus had crashed, and all passengers perished. Locals believed their spirits lingered, seeking redemption. The man in the tattered suit matched the description of the church's pastor. I realized that by picking him up, I had become entangled in their quest for peace. The rules were not just guidelines, but protections against the town's restless spirits. Each violation brought me closer to their world. I needed to be cautious, for the line between the living and the dead was perilously thin in Pine Hollow. I resolved to follow the rules, meticulously hoping to survive the night shifts, but deep down, I knew that the town's darkness was far from over. One evening, the dispatcher handed me a sealed envelope. "This came for you," he said. His voice trembling inside was a note. Your final test awaits midnight. The crossroads. I felt a chill run down my spine. The crossroads were known to be a place of ancient rituals and dark happenings. As midnight approached, drove to the location, the air thick with anticipation. A figure stood in the center, cloaked and hooded. As I approached, the figure raised its head, revealing a face identical to mine. To break the cycle, one must confront oneself. It whispered suddenly. Memories of all the passengers I'd picked up flooded my mind. Each one was a reflection of my own fears, regrets, and since the figure extended its hand, and I felt an overwhelming urge to take it. As our hands touched, a blinding light enveloped us. Visions of the town's history, its tragedies and its curses flashed before me. I saw the origins of the rules created by those who had faced the darkness and survived the light. Faded, and I found myself alone at the crossroads. The air felt lighter. Oppressive weight lifted, returning to the dispatch center. The dispatcher greeted me with a knowing smile. You've done it, he said. The town is free. From that night on, Pine Hollow changed. The fog lifted, the roads became safer, and the eerie occurrences ceased. The rules were no longer needed, and the manual was retired. I continued driving, but now the passengers were real, their destinations mundane. The town began to thrive, its dark past becoming a distant memory. I often thought about the figure at the crossroads and the journey I'd undertaken. It had been a test of courage, understanding, and redemption. Pine Hollow had given me a second chance, and I was determined to make the most of it. Years passed, and the story of Pine Hollow's transformation became a local legend. Tourists visited, curious about the town's haunted past. I share my experiences, hoping to educate and warn others. The dispatcher retired, and I took over his role, guiding new drivers and ensuring they knew the town's history. The manual remained in the office, a relic of a bygone era. Occasionally I glance at it, reminded of the nights filled with terror and the rules that had kept me alive. Pine Hollow had changed, but its lessons remained. One evening, a young driver approached me, holding the old manual. Do we still need this? He asked. I smiled, taking the manual from him. Not anymore, I replied, placing it back on the shelf. As I turned away, the radio crackled to life. Pick up at the old church on Miller's Road, a voice whispered. I froze, the memories flooding back. Perhaps the darkness hadn't been vanquished entirely. Perhaps in Pine Hollow, the past never truly dies, and the rules, they might still be our only protection. I turned back to the young driver, concern etched on my face. Maybe it's time we revisit the manual, said. He nodded, sensing the gravity of the situation. We sat down, flipping through the pages, the rules now more relevant than ever. The town's peace was fragile, and the veil between worlds thin as night fell. We prepared for what lay ahead, knowing that in Pine Hollow, the darkness always lurked just beneath the surface, and the rules, they were our lifeline. Once more, story. Story 2. We got a call for pickup at Collins. They're going to the airport. You got it? Sure, I'm on it. Those were the first words spoken, and what would end up as one of the scariest and most nerve-wracking days of my young life. I wouldn't have a more grueling day until the birth of my first child that at least was a positive experience. This was truly the exact opposite. It was still early in the day, and I had already drove one couple to the bus station. Things were looking up, a welcome change from the previous 4 days. The fare was in an upper-crust neighborhood. Those folks would often tip big money if you got them to where they were going. Quickly from call to door took me 7.5 minutes, hardly a record, but it had likely earned me a decent tip. No one was outside waiting, so I made a quick beep with my horn. A moment later, cute blonde stuck her head out of the upstairs window. Just a minute, I slipped the transmission in the park and leaned back leisurely in my seat. That summer had to have been the hottest memory. Even with her AC on, was still soaked. My mind began to wander a moment or two. Later, the cute blonde came out to the cab, but she wasn't alone. A dirty, long-haired man came out with her. When they got into the cab, I could tell that they were junkies. Where's your luggage? We're going to the airport, right? They looked at each other for a second before answering. Yeah, sure. The dirty guy confirmed this, but said nothing about their banks. Okay. I shrugged my shoulders and turned around. It was my job to mind-read hopheads. I started the cab up and pulled away for most of the drive. Nothing much was said. They would whisper to one another on occasion, but none of the volume I could hear. I'd catch a glance at the blonde of the mirror at brief intervals. She caught me a few times looking and smiled. Each time she flashed her now decayed teeth, I felt a small pang of sadness. She had obviously been a beauty before the dope took over her life. You could still see this when you saw her from a distance. But as you approached, the deep wrinkles and open sores made her vices painfully obvious. These were my thoughts. When the man called out to me, "Amen, there's a change of plans. We're going to need you to take herself somewhere." Somewhere else, as he said this, haphazardly pointed the head to a sign. "We need you to go over the viaduct to Polk." His words made me bristle. Not only was I not going to change the destination, I knew the area around Polk was dangerous. He more than likely wanted to score something. I didn't care what he wanted. I wasn't going anywhere near that place. "Listen, I'm sorry, son. Once we set a destination, we can't just change it. It's a former driver security. You understand, there's plenty of cabs, the airport. You can catch another one there and then you can take it where you want to go, of course." This wasn't completely true. I could change the route as long as I called in, told dispatch. Fact was, I wasn't going anywhere near that place. Odds were no other driver would either. I looked into my rearview mirror as I told him this. I noticed the blonde whispers something him. A smile grew across his face as she said it, and a confident air began emanating from the both. They certainly confused me. I wasn't sure if they understood what I've told them. Perhaps all the drugs that they had taken had finally fried their brains. They, in fact, understood me, Foley. That would appear that was the one that didn't grasp the importance of the situation. They were going to have to show me. "You don't understand. Understand, old man. You're driving us there with a Hugh, one tool, or not." His arrogance made me laugh, however. When I looked up into the mirror, I knew why I came, eye to eye with a... Now it all made sense. They likely never had any intent on going to the airport. And they knew if they said anything about Polk, this batch would have never sent me. That meant nothing. Now I was going to do what they told me to do, and hopefully I wouldn't get shot in the process. "All right, I got the point. You can put the gun down. I'll take you over to Polk." As I said it, they both chuckled, and the guy lowered the pistol to his lap. "Well, I'm glad we comprehend each other now." He pointed again to the viaduct exits, and I took it. The viaduct was nothing more than a big bridge that took traffic over the train tracks below. It had always been the artery that connected the safer, more productive part of the city to the crime-ridden ghetto on the other side of the tracks. We never went over to its inn. I hadn't until today. As my wheels hold onto it, too sick feeling began boiling in my gut. I wasn't really sure what I was going into. I hadn't been over the track since I was a kid. It was the earliest then, even before the viaduct, and the neighborhood was okay. However, after the race riots a few years later, I figured I'd be safer on my side of the tracks and hadn't been back since. I'd heard stories and seen various pieces in the paper about how much had changed, but I knew no one who had seen that firsthand coming down off the viaduct. Things looked basically the same as I drove deeper into the neighborhood. However, things began falling apart. It was actually really sad. The little barbecue place I used to go to with my dad was boarded up. What I saw was decay, not danger. I quickly wiped a tear away from my cheek and asked my captors where I was headed. I had yet to turn around to address them. I was afraid to get nervous and just shoot me. All of our discussions were done through the mirror when we reached Hulk Street. "Up here, take a left and pull over." The end of the sentence made the taste of bile grow stronger in my mouth. I glanced down quickly at his lap, and the gun was still there, cocked in his grip. Was he going to end my life and leave me here? My body began shaking, but I fought to stop it. I didn't want him to see fear. I had never been so afraid in my life. Waked my sweaty palms under my slacks and swallowed the massive lump in my throat when I reached Polk. I turned to the left and went ahead about 20 yards before I pulled over. I opposed slid the shifter into park and shut off the ignition. Instinctively, I sat upright and swallowed one more time. My mouth was bone dry, and I knew if I spoke, the words would tremble as I sat. The staring ahead. The cab was silent. Off in the distance, two boys played catch with a football in the street. Silence was maddening. Was this the end? What did they have planned? My thoughts went to my family. I hoped my wife would be notified. Somehow, would she get my body? Or would I stay in this cab rotting away for God knows how long? The dirty guy finally spoke. Take off your watch and pass that through you in your wallet. Back to Annie and don't turn around when you do it. So that was the blondes. Name they were definitely going to pop me since he was using names. I did my best not to let them see me shake as I did it. When I passed them back, I could feel the trembling. She let out a little chuckle as she took them from my hand. Well, and they had everything they needed. And this was probably it now. Hand me the keys. This made me even more terrified. They were going to shoot me and take my cab. It looked like my wife was never even going to be able to bury me. I did my best to hide the tears. I could hear the couple begin to shuffle around in the back. I was terrified to look in the mirror. I didn't want to see it coming. I took one more big gulp and closed my eyes as I waited. An image of my wife appeared in my mind. She was wearing a beautiful little red dress I'd bought her for our anniversary. Her hair was up and she was sitting in our Lincoln. It was the most beautiful. I'd seen her since our first date. The sound of a car door opening came from behind me, but I ignored it. This is too wonderful of a sight to leave. But the sounds of people running soon after roused me from my fantasy. I was too afraid to turn around at first. Slowly I opened my eyes and peeked at the furthest point of my vision that I could. It looked like the door and the passenger rear was open, so I summed up the courage to glance at my rearview mirror. There didn't look to be anyone there when I finally turned around. Feeling of relief overwhelmed me. It appeared they didn't want to kill me. They've got what they needed and took off. At that moment, I didn't care that I was $50 lighter. I was just happy to be alive. The celebrations continued for the next few minutes until the weight of the situation dawned on me, alive or not. I didn't want to be in this neighborhood after dark. From the way it was looking, it was skidding into late afternoon. Although it was summer and the sun didn't go down until it was going to take me a while to hotwire the cab, walking wasn't even a consideration. I twisted myself upside down and under the I'd never hot-wired a car before. However, I was going to try my best to find out how. It took me about an hour to figure out the wiring setup. Another or so later, the sound of the ignition turning over. Shock, the cab to life. James. Say a cab, answer right now. Where are you? The panicked yells of my dispatcher. Cheryl came blasting for my radio. I took a second to catch my breath before I responded. What in the world was I going to say? I did my best to explain all that happened that morning as I drove back toward the garage. It was a tad, but after 3, when I finally pulled in, my first priority was to call my wife and let her know that I was doing okay since my keys had been taken. Night. Told her there would be a guy coming to the house to change the locks. Her voice was so beautiful to hear, I reluctantly let her go when the police arrived to take my report. After sitting down with them, I took the rest of the day off. Was still pretty shaken up about all that had happened. My generation didn't have a war. It hadn't hardened to the prospect of dying. The wife and I spent some time holding each other. I wiped her tears as we made plans of future trips together. I promised to spend less time working and more at home. The locksmith showed up soon after all the locks were changed, and I took the Link into the dealership, and the next day to have it Richie. I returned to driving a day or two. Later, day by day, I became less jumpy, and the fear of having someone behind me got less and less terrifying. Despite my expectations, the dope heads were eventually caught. The blonde did indeed spawn from an affluent family, and her charges were ultimately dropped. The dirty men did some Monson County. I had lost interest in the case by then. My son was on the way, and I was working any spare moment I had, so we'd had enough. Our anniversary came a few months before our son arrived. We stuck to the promises that we made that night. The family saw a lot of the country those years, and her and I still rent a cabin in Colorado. From time to time I stayed on the streets for the next years. No incident near that bad ever happened again. I've been working dispatch since a combination of bad luck and failing eyesight forced the change. In a really mind anyway. People drive like crazy these days with the rise of companies like Uber. I figured our line of work won't be around much longer. With my part in the business coming to an end, I'd like to pass on one bit of advice that comes from my experience in a time full of no end and distractions. Please pay attention to who you let into your cab. Drugged crazy thieves and gun-wielding dope heads don't seem to be going away anytime soon. Music. The following is an excerpt from a letter. Story 3. Discovered among my grandfather's papers by my father and myself while making an inventory of his estates upon his death in February. Keep in mind, none of the assertions made within have been confirmed at the time of posting, and considering the time in which the events were said to have taken place, It may never be possible to confirm them. In addition, at the time it was written, my grandfather was already in the advanced stages of brain cancer. The things he is claiming more than likely were symptoms of his illness and may have not actually even occurred. Please keep these things in mind as you read this. As it pertains to the publishing of this document, we're only making this document public at this time in the interests of justice. If any of the names or incidents herein are familiar, or if anyone has any information pertaining to said people or incidents, please leave your contact information in the comments. Thank you. My name's Donald McIntyre Campbell. This year I reached my saint year on this earth. Recently, due to severe headaches, I consulted my doctor during the course of testing, and like it was discovered that I have a large mass of cancer growing in my brain because of my age. Mostly the great minds in charge of my care determined there was no possible treatment for my illness because of this. Conclusion. I was told I could not expect to see my ND birthday. Truthfully, I can claim to be very upset with his prognosis. I have had a far longer life than most, and can assure you all did my best to live every moment of it honorably. There is, however, one incident. I must relieve my soul before I go before my Maker, not because I am especially devout man, but because I've never believed in leaving one's debts outstanding. The specific debt I'm referring to took place in the winter of Dorothy, and I had been married 3 wonderful years. With the end of the war, jobs had been a little thin on the ground. Luckily for us, people were still dying. Therefore, she was able to find work as a part-time secretary at Blevins Lackland Funeral Home. As for me, I had been at the sawmill since I was 15. The post-war suburban boom had well and truly begun by this time, and the demand for building materials was at its highest. I'd been moved into a supervisor's position the year before. Because of this, we were finally in a position that purchased our first home just a mere 2 months after my promotion. We found a nice 3-bedroom house not far from where I'd grown up. Now that we had purchased our home, we could focus more on starting a family. Don't get me wrong. We've been allowing nature to take its course since we'd been married, but now having children have become our prime goal. It looked as if though our life was getting better by the day. That December, we both had been working as many hours as we could. Christmas was closely approaching, and we knew that would probably be our last holiday, where it was just the 2 of us. The Red Chinese were slaughtering our boys in Korea. For all I knew, I'd be in a hole fighting commies the next year. We had one last chance to spoil one another, and I was going to make it good since we only had the 1 car. Dorothy would at some points have to get a cab to and from the funeral home. My surprise was a brand new car of her own. I couldn't wait to see her face. The week before, I made all the arrangements. The dealer would deliver the night before, so everything would be in place for the big reveal that morning. The evening of the St. Dorothy worked late, so I was left on my own to stir up dinner. The partners wanted to get everything caught up for the holidays. It was near before I heard the cab pull up outside. I was joining an after-dinner beer next to the radio when she came in. I could tell from the get-go that something was wrong. Before I could get one word out, I was shut down. I'm going to take a bath and go to bed. She had to have been starving, but I didn't push. We'd both been running ourselves ragged the past few weeks. The fatigue had most likely caught up with her, and she now deserves some time to herself. I had one more beer and hit the sack. About an hour later, Dorothy was already deep asleep. I gave her a light pack on her forehead. She looked so peaceful as she laid there, as if she hadn't a care in the world. It wouldn't be until after the holiday that I would learn how terribly wrong I was. Once I'd switched off the bedside lamp, I too drifted off in mere minutes. The smell of bacon and coffee woke me up the next morning when I sat down at the table. Dorothy still seemed a bit off, but still better than the previous night. She smiled very little, and when she did, it felt forced, although I had never seen her like this. We were in uncharted territory. I know if I had to keep all the balls in the air that she did, I would have collapsed far sooner. Nothing would be gained by nagging her. She knew. If she needed help, I'd bent over backwards for her. Whittle was said the next few days, but I could see pieces of the old Dorothy peeking through. By a Christmas Eve dinner, she was doing far better. The excitement in the air had us all smiling. Even Dorothy. After dinner, we swapped gifts with her folks. They left around, and we had the house to ourselves before I can even get warmed up. She shut me down. We both went to bed that night with a frown on our faces. During a trip to the head around a.m., I took a quick peek out the bedroom window. Just as arranged, Dorothy's brand new Ford was sitting in our drive, wrapped in a big red bow. I slipped out of bed a little after to get breakfast ready for my big surprise. Just after Dorothy came down slightly groggy and full of questions. "Merry Christmas. Honey, hurry up and eat your breakfast. I still have to give you your present." When she'd awakened fully, she lit up the kitchen. Her beautiful lights had returned, and I was elated. Breakfast went by in a flash. Now is the time for her present. With her hands over her eyes, we stepped out into the cold December morning. "Okay, open your eyes." The shock on her face was priceless. For a moment she looked at me unsure. "Merry Christmas, it's yours." I handed her the keys and she ran over to get a closer look. I watched her as she played with all the switches and knobs. This had to be the happiest I'd seen her in ages now. "You'll never have to take a cab again." My words hung in the air. Her face had dropped like a stone, and tears began pouring from her eyes. Without a word, she ran into the house, leaving me clueless. I tried to be understanding, but this was beyond stress. There had to be something. She was hiding, and I was determined to find out, and I wished now that I never had. When I climbed the stairs, I found her sobbing on the bed. "But God's sakes, what is wrong with you? You've been walking around like a grump for the whole weekend." She said nothing, but the sobbing continued. Say something. I felt bad, even as I said it, but I was at my wit's end as I sat next to her. I wrapped my arms around her. I was now at the point of begging. "Please, baby, you're obviously hurting. Let it out. Let me help you." She let out a long sigh and eventually spoke. "The other night, Friday, the cab driver, he pulled over behind the building and he forced himself on me." Her words knocked the air out of me. I feared anything I said I may regret. Some time passed before either one of us spoke again, and what was I supposed to say? Nothing could make it better. The best I could do was be there for her. I held her as she sobbed. As we sat there on that bed, a plan for revenge began to take shape in my mind. That piece of scum dimmed the light that had once shone so brightly inside my Dorothy, and he had to pay for it. Dorothy's reluctance to report the attack would ultimately play in my favor. Since there was no record, I would likely not be a suspect also, unless the sleazo had done it before and been caught. The police would possibly be in the dark regarding a motive. If I was going to do it to not get caught, I had to be careful. I was going to take at least a few weeks of planning. My pop always told me nothing was worth doing if it wasn't worth doing well. In this case, that would certainly apply. We'd fallen asleep that morning as we held each other around for. I got up and started making dinner. After what she told me, I wasn't sure if she would feel like heating, but making dinner was the least I could do for her. I can't even pretend to understand women and how they think, let alone know what it would feel like for a woman as noble as Dorothy to have her self-respect ripped from her. Just thinking about it made me fume. But this wasn't about me. I wanted to make it as easy as possible for her, to begin to put this behind her. As for me, I knew I couldn't until I punished him for this crime. Every day that passed was a little victory. Dorothy became more and more like she once was, and I would get a little closer to my prey. Weeks of casual conversation, a few anonymous phone calls finally led me to a named Bobby Dunlap. He was, and other than a few misdemeanors, his habit of doing things to women had gone unnoticed by the cops. From what I could tell, no one was waiting for him at home either, and this information sealed the deal. Now a long line needed was to pick the perfect time. After a phone call in which I pretended to be one of Dunlap's friends, I knew when he'd be working since the holidays had ended. I wanted to strike as quickly as possible. Moving forward was all I wanted at that point, so I chose that Wednesday to spring my trap. After dinner that night, took my car to Patty's and had a few drinks. I made a call to the cab service to send Bobby to pick me up. Since I've given the dispatcher a false address and name, I had little fear the call would be traced back to me. Dunlap arrived within a few minutes. This was the beginning of the second part of my plan. During our ride, I made small talk in order to relax him a bit. "So you're a young and good-looking guy. You know of any girls we could get together with and have a good time?" It was obvious. My plan was working. He wasn't even aware of where he was taking me, and we pulled up to the building. I didn't move or speak. He sat still in his seat, unsure of what I was doing. "What's wrong?" "Bobby, don't you recognize the place?" He started shifting around in his seat. I could tell he was beginning to catch on. "That beautiful woman, the one you met on the seat, that was my wife." When I said that, he really started squirming. "No way, man. She came onto me. I didn't know she was married." His lies were starting to make me angry. I decided to move ahead with a final phase even. "Why all you want, scumbag? I know my wife. I would have been a lot nicer if you would have admitted what you did." The sweat was pouring down his face. He knew what I was going to do the second I stuck my pistol in his neck. He shot upright, drives out to the lake where we'll have some privacy during the drive to the lake. He began shaking and the sweating became even worse. I had him pull up to one of the boat ramps and get out of the car. It was like he'd already given up. I didn't even have to tell him to get on his knees. I guess he thought that begging would change my mind, so sorry I couldn't help myself. It was time to end this. I'll see you in hell. 2 shots in the head, and he was gone. I carefully removed my coats and slacks, exposing my coveralls underneath. Once I had loaded his body into the trunk, I removed the coveralls and threw him into the trunk with Bobby and the gun, just to be sure I didn't forget anything. I sat for a moment in the car to collect my thoughts. When I was satisfied, I redressed and started the car, and one quick motion, I wedged a stone next to the gas pedal and threw the car into drive. Watching that cab shoot into the water gave me the feeling of accomplishment I had been chasing for weeks, even though I had a 7-mile walk and it was degrees outside. That nights I didn't feel a bit of it. In fact, that was the best I'd felt in months. Made it to my car around and drove the rest of the way home. When I got there, Dorothy was already in bed. I tried not to wake her as I got undressed. If I did, she said nothing. The next morning at breakfast, she didn't ask where I had been the night before, and that's the way it was for the remaining years of our marriage. As smart as she was, some sure she had her suspicions, but she held her tongue. After all, that was all in the past. We were moving forward. It was about a month later when I received my draft orders. Not until I came home in the fall of did we finally get to start our family. Dorothy discovered she was pregnant with Donald Jr. in October. Christine was born in September of, and that was pretty much it. The adjustment period after coming home took a while. However, Dorothy was there to help me through the rougher parts. It wasn't until I lost her in that I realized how much I had come to rely on her. Now that it's my turn to pass, so on, the only hope I have is that I will get to see my Dorothy again. Since we are coming to the end of my story, I want to ensure all law enforcement involved with this case that no one in my family, living or dead, had any knowledge of what I did all those years ago. What occurred on the lakeshore was only between myself, Dunlap, and God. Please don't hold what I did to that scum against my loved ones. Their only crime is being related to me, and that's no fault of their own. I ask whoever discovers this letter to turn it over to the police in whatever way they desire. This is my final confession of what I did to that cab driver, Bobby Dunlap, on the night of January the May he burn in hell forever. Sincerely, Donald McIntyre Campbell. Story 4. I would have posted this story sooner, but I just returned from a week-long vacation in California with my mother. It was supposed to be a relaxing visit, sunny beaches, quality time, and a brief escape from the chaos of everyday life. Instead, the trip was overshadowed by a horrifying event that unfolded before I even boarded the plane. What happened that morning has stayed with me ever since, and I feel the need to share it in the hopes that maybe it helps someone else be more cautious. The incident occurred during what was supposed to be a routine taxi ride to the airport last week. My parents divorced when I was a child. I must have been around 7 or 8. It was decided that I would live with my mom and spend weekends with my dad. That arrangement worked well enough until college came around. I ended up choosing to stay in Oklahoma for school. I wanted familiarity and stability, while my mom had plans to move to Los Angeles with her boyfriend, so I moved in with my dad for my first year at university. Despite the distance, I made it a point to visit my mom every summer. We'd spend a week or 2 together in California. It became a cherished tradition, a time to reconnect. Last week was supposed to be just another one of those trips. My flight was scheduled for 1:00 p.m. that day. Wanting to be safe and punctual, I arranged for a taxi to pick me up at 10:00 a.m. Under normal conditions, the drive from my apartment to the airport takes about 30 to 35 minutes. I always plan ahead, giving myself a comfortable 2-hour window to get through security and deal with any unexpected hiccups. The driver arrived just a few minutes after 10:00, which didn't bother me at all. At that point, I wasn't worried. We still had more than enough time to make it to the airport comfortably. However, from the moment we pulled onto the main road, something felt off. The cabbie drove aggressively, weaving through traffic and accelerating in short, sharp bursts. I'm no stranger to speeding. I've got a bit of a lead foot myself, but this was excessive. It wasn't until the tires screeched as we rounded a curve that I felt compelled to say something. "Look, man, we've got plenty of time. You don't have to drive so fast," I said, hoping to ease the situation. He replied, but I couldn't make out what he said. His accent was very thick, and though I didn't want to come across as rude or prejudiced, the language barrier was significant. I smiled and nodded politely, hoping he understood the gist of my concern. For a few minutes he did slow down. Unfortunately, he seemed to interpret my attempt at conversation as an invitation to talk. He began chatting animatedly, gesturing occasionally and glancing back at me instead of watching the road. I continued nodding, still not understanding much of what he was saying. Meanwhile, his speed began creeping up again. He drove more erratically, swerving around other cars, cutting off bicyclists and drawing honks from fellow drivers. About 10 minutes from the airport, we were stopped at a red light behind a man on a bicycle. When the light turned green, the cyclist began pedaling across the intersection. The cab driver, seemingly distracted, didn't notice right away. When he finally looked up and realized the light had changed, he stomped on the gas. The cab lurched forward, closing the distance between us and the cyclist in an instant. There was no time for the cyclist to react. The taxi struck him with brutal force. The man and his bike flew over the hood of the car, crashing into the grass on the far side of the road. I screamed. It was instinctual. The worst injury I'd ever seen before that moment was when a cheerleader at school broke her ankle during practice. This was 1,000 times more horrific. The sound of the impact, the image of the man flipping through the air, his body crumpling on the ground. I don't think the cab driver even realized what had happened until I yelled. He looked at me, confused, until I pointed at the fallen cyclist and shouted for him to stop the car. Reluctantly, he turned the vehicle around and pulled into a nearby parking lot. By the time we parked, a small crowd had gathered around the injured man. A couple of people were kneeling beside him, trying to help. Others were shouting and pointing, clearly addressing the cab driver, who walked over slowly with a dazed expression. I stayed in the cab at first, frozen, watching from across the street. I eventually stepped out and stood near the rear of the taxi, torn between wanting to help and not knowing how. I watched helplessly as paramedics arrived and began treating the cyclist. He wasn't moving. I couldn't tell if he was conscious or even alive. The police arrived shortly after. An officer approached me, notebook in hand, and I told him everything I had seen and experienced from the moment I got into the cab. I was honest. I didn't want to get the driver into more trouble than necessary, but I couldn't in good conscience leave out any details. As far as I was concerned, he shouldn't have been behind the wheel. By the time the police finished questioning me, it was well past my departure time. My flight had taken off without me. One of the officers, clearly sympathetic, arranged for another ride to take me home. I called the airline and managed to reschedule my flight for the next afternoon. This time, I used Uber. My new driver was quiet, respectful, and most importantly, he obeyed traffic laws. We arrived at the airport without incident, and I caught my flight without any issues. But throughout the entire trip to California, the memory of that cyclist haunted me. Even as my mum and I enjoyed the beaches and good food, even as we laughed and caught up on life, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. Was he okay? Did he survive? Was his family with him? I still don't know. Since I got back yesterday, I haven't heard anything from the police. They took down my number. They said they'd follow up if they needed more information. But so far, silence. Tomorrow, I plan to call the officer who handled my statement. I just need to know what happened. I don't know what will become of the cab driver either. Maybe it was just a tragic accident. Maybe he was negligent. But one thing is certain. He shouldn't be driving passengers until a thorough review is done. One mistake, one moment of distraction, and lives change forever. If I hear any updates, I'll be sure to share them. For now, I just needed to get this off my chest. Stay safe out there. You never know when an ordinary day can veer into tragedy. Story 5. I've had in the 10+ years of driving a cab, I picked up this well-dressed and good-looking, middle-aged guy. However, when he opened his mouth, he said the strangest things. What started out as an entertaining discussion ended up as an all-consuming fear and going to write down and post. Everything I remember that happened and was said between the two of us then, whoever reads it can tell me if I'm crazy or just being paranoid. Saturday nights I was working the graveyard. Most of my fares come from bars, and I just dropped off a pair of drunk bimbos. I only say bimbos because the redhead claims she didn't have enough for a tip. Instead, she decided to show me a rack, unasked. By the way, I admit they were nice, but I prefer girls my own caste. It was around AM when I noticed a well-dressed tall man waving me down the neighborhood. Combined with his fancy suit spoke possible big tipper to me. Once he got in and closed the door, he removed his hats. Oh, Fine-looking straw fedora, his clothing in movie star good looks were out of place. I feared at first that I'd picked up a time traveler. I did the usual one, asked him where he was headed. I don't know, really, I'm in town on business and was looking for somebody to show me around. His answer made me chuckle. It seemed awful late for a sightseeing trip. Hey, as long as you pay me, mister, I'll drive you anywhere. And that was how it all started. For the next 2 hours or so, I showed him around. Town, the university, the Capitol building, the usual touristy stuff at some point. During our little tour, I remember why he said he was in town. So what kind of business are you? In his reply made me laugh even more than his first. The guy was a natural comedian on what people would call the contract killer. We've been having such a good time so far, I decided to go with the ruse. Okay, mister, I'll play along. Well, tell me how it works. How does Cell 1 go about hiring a contract killer? Well, a woman contacts me. Now they do so, I'll keep to myself if their reference checks out. We move on to business. She gives me names and any other info I asked for. If I decide to take the job, we move on to money. If we agree on a number, then I go to work with all that. Anonymity. I asked him how he made sure he got paid after he offed someone. It appeared my choice of words made him laugh. It probably wouldn't be wise to tell you that part. We professionals have to keep some secrets to ourselves, okay? Fair enough. Well then, how does a client know you've completed the job? I regretted asking the question even before I finished asking it. Even though it was a stupid question, he still entertained me with an answer, albeit with a tinge of sarcasm in his voice. We live in a time with an hour news cycle in multiple social media outlets, don't you think if your dad died suddenly that someone's not going to contact your mother first if you don't discover it on your own? Someone's going to tell you, once I'm paid, my relationship with the customer ends. She's ultimately on her own after that. The last part of his answer brought up another question in my mind. If something goes wrong per se and she gets arrested or implicates herself, what do you do? He thought for a moment before answering. Imagine he was considering how much he should say to a stranger driving his taxi. Well, sometime contingencies have been put in place to protect myself. First off, if I've done my job right, the client shouldn't have any information about me to give the cops. And if on the off chance I screw up so badly that can I have multiple exit strategies? I certainly won't let the police get their hands on me. None of us get to live forever. There were a few times I had to remind myself this was all the game. He made it fun. Nonetheless, his imagination and forethought wowed me. We've been playing this game for hours before I thought to ask him how he got started in his business. I joined the army fresh out of high school. I'd seen my work caught the attention of my superiors. They referred me to a couple of gentlemen in the government, and I've worked for them for 10 years before I made the decision to go into business for myself. I gotta tell you, mister, you're really good at this stuff. You really should be a storyteller if that's not what you're really doing for a living. I'm seriously impressed, and that wasn't blowing smoke. This was the most fun I'd had driving a cab in my life. I was used to dealing with drunks and arrogant businessmen. This was a blast. Well, thank you, young man. I appreciate everything you've shown me. Tonight, I could tell by the way he was talking, the night was coming to an end. It was just as well the sun would be up soon, and I was beginning to flag myself. I took the opportunity to ask one more question, one I should have asked far earlier. He had said earlier tonight he was in town for business. Did that mean he was here to off someone? A sly grin grew across his face as he thought of his answer. Well, as a matter of fact, I received a message at the last minute to cancel the hit, and I get to keep the half she'd already given me, so I didn't mind. That's business. It happens on occasion. That's a woman's prerogative after all, isn't it? To change their minds. I hope her and her old man work it out anyhow. That's how I ended up with you, just as the first rays of the sun broke over the horizon. He pointed out a place to let him out. There were a few hotels at the end of the parking lot, and I assumed that was where he was headed. He reached over the seats and handed me a $1,000 bill. Before I could argue, he told me to keep the change. It was twice what he owed, but I was too tired to disagree. Keep the change, kid. You earned it. I had a great time tonight. Thank you, mister. I had a great time myself, and thank you most of all for the awesome story. As he stepped from the crab, he said one last thing, and thank you for showing me around tonight, Adam. Take care of Linda and stay out of trouble. I pulled out of the lot and headed for home. My hope was that Linda would have breakfast going, and that's when it hit me like a hammer. How did that man know my name? Not to mention my wife's. My license was nowhere. He could have seen it. I reenacted the night's discussion in my head. There was never a point in which I told him it would have ruined the game. I didn't ask him his, and there was no reason for me to tell him mine, certainly not my wife's. How did he know I was married anyway? I hadn't worn a ring in years. I lost it down a drain and never found it. I suppose he could have guessed the problem with that is that Linda and I had just gotten back together last week. We've been separated and considering divorce for 2 years before. But when I pulled into the driveway, a terrible idea came into my head. Was there a possibility that guy wasn't making up a story? No one would dare tell someone, even a stranger, in such a bold and frank way that he was a hitman. If he was serious, the fact he knew my name and my wife's could only mean one thing. Even if it was true, I wasn't ready to accept it. While Linda and I sat and ate that morning, I couldn't stop myself from watching her. I was terrified that my wife had wanted me dead, even if she had changed her mind. There was no way she'd admit it. If I did ask, either answer would most likely destroy the fragile peace we've built between us. I need to know what the readers think. Am I crazy, or is this really happening? Story 6. A simple weekend visit, just me, a borrowed duffel bag and a train ticket to a quiet little town outside Chicago, where my cousin had moved last year. But the moment I stepped off that rickety train into the fog-drenched platform, something felt wrong. The air was unusually thick, like it hadn't moved in hours, and the people, they didn't talk, they didn't blink either. They just stared, expressionless, like mannequins with dust in their joints. I thought I was being paranoid until the station clock began ticking backward and a yellow taxi pulled up without a sound. No engine rumble, no tires crunching gravel, just there. The driver never looked at me, only gestured to the back seat with a pale, gloved hand. I hesitated, but I'd already texted my cousin I was on the way, and my phone suddenly had no signal. With a nervous laugh, I slid into the cab. Interior smelled faintly of burnt paper and lavender. The doors locked by themselves. Then, without touching the wheel, the driver spoke in a voice like gravel grinding steel. Do not break the rules. The cab interior smelled faintly like burning plastic, and the radio buzzed with static that sometimes sounded like breathing. Every window was fogged, but we hadn't driven through rain or fog. I wiped one with my sleeve, only to see nothing but blackness outside, not even the road beneath us. My stomach twisted. "Hey man, I think you're going the wrong way," I said nervously. He didn't blink, his hands didn't move, but the taxi kept driving smooth and silent, like it was floating. Reached for my phone to call my cousin, but my signal had disappeared the moment we left the station. When I opened Google Maps, the screen glitched and froze. Then it showed a pin labeled nowhere. My heart pounded harder. "Let me out," I said. "You agreed to the ride," he replied. "You follow it to the end." I banged on the window, but it felt like solid rock. No give, no sound echoed back. The driver's rearview mirror showed his eyes watching me, but his face was frozen in a blank, emotionless mask. Suddenly the cab swerved, not from the road, but into some other space entirely. One moment I saw cornfields, the next it was an endless tunnel of flickering lights and smoky shadows racing alongside us. Faces began appearing in the window, pressed against the glass, screaming silently. I stared, breathless, as one of the faces looked like me. I tried the door handle. It melted in my hand like wax. The seatbelt tightened without me touching it, locking me down. "He never lets them out," a voice whispered from the floor. I looked down. There was a mouth in the carpet, stitched closed with hair. I tried kicking at the floor, but only rippled like black oil. The GPS on the dashboard blinked once, then displayed eternal destination miles. Sweat beaded on my forehead. This wasn't just a driver with a bad attitude. This was something else, something wrong. Then the driver finally spoke again, his voice layered like 3 people talking at once. "The rules were posted. You stepped in. You ride until the end or until you break it." I noticed the fare meter was spinning backward at lightning speed. When I blinked, we were suddenly inside a city, Chicago, but not the one I knew. All the buildings were melted, looking like they had been through fire. The people walking the streets all had blank faces, no eyes, no mouths. They turned to look at me, all of them in perfect slow unison. The cab stopped in front of an old diner glowing with sickly green neon lights that pulsed like a heartbeat. The driver turned around slowly, his neck cracking. Loudly as he did, "You're hungry. Go in." I'll wait against every instinct I had. Opened the door, which now worked, and stepped out. The street beneath me felt too soft, almost like flesh inside the diner. There were people sitting at booths, but none of them moved. They were mannequins, every single one a waitress. Shuffled up to me, her smile cut too wide and her eyes cloudy like boiled milk. "Burger and a milkshake?" she asked. I nodded, not knowing what else to do. She slid it across the counter, but the burger twitched the meat. Moved it, pulsed, it was still alive. I ran out of the diner while rising in my throat and dove back into the taxi. The driver was smiling now, barely, but it was a smile nonetheless. Most don't come back. "You're different." He pressed the gas, and we sped through red lights that didn't seem to apply. The landscape changed again, flickering between cornfields, cemeteries, and a twisted version of Chicago where skyscrapers were made of bone. Every time I blinked, the outside world was different. At one point we drove past a dozen cabs just like ours, all crashed, burning or empty. "Who are you?" I shouted. "I'm the last driver you'll ever need," he replied. "I take the forgotten in where they belong." I looked down at my seat. It was stitched together from different fabrics. Some of it looked like skin. I leaned closer to the front, squinting at the driver's ID badge, but where his name should have been, it just said, "Do not look." I looked anyway. My own face stared back at me from the badge, eyes wide with horror. The rear view mirror showed no driver, only an empty seat, yet I could still hear the breathing. It wasn't him who was driving anymore. It was the taxi itself. "You broke the one rule," the voice said again. You looked at my fingers, started going numb. My reflection was changing. It was still me, but not. Its smile was too wide. Its eyes were glowing red, and it waved at me the next time we stopped. It was in the middle of a massive cornfield under a sky with no stars. The moon was red, massive and too close. "Ouch," the driver said. I hesitated, but something pushed me out of the cab, literally pushed. There were no roads, no houses, just rows and rows of corn that rustled on their own. I turned around to protest, but the taxi was gone. No headlights, no trail, just emptiness. And that's when I heard the rustling turn into footsteps. Something moved between the stalks, tall, then shapes whispering in a language I didn't understand. I backed away slowly, but the whispers got louder. One shape stepped into the clearing. Its face was blank, and it was wearing my clothes. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran. The corn scraped my arms, but I didn't care. Every direction looked the same, and I swear the rows were shifting behind me, trapping me in. I stumbled into a small clearing with a mirror in the middle, not a bathroom mirror, a tall, freestanding antique one with golden trim. I saw myself in it, but I was smiling even though I wasn't. My reflection reached out and touched the glass, and my chest began to burn. Lifted my shirt. The skin on my chest was warping, forming numbers. "Driver." The whispers turned to laughter, now deep, mocking, hungry. Turned, and the corn parted, revealing the taxi again, door wide open. Waiting, I got back in. What else could I do? It was either the mirror or the cab, and both were nightmares. The driver didn't speak again, but the radio finally worked. It played a recording of my own voice from earlier, screaming inside the diner. Cover my ears, but it played from every speaker, every corner of the car, the road. Ahead became sharper, more jagged, like we were driving through broken glass. Outside, the world had turned upside down. Trees grew from clouds, buildings swayed like seaweed, and I realized this wasn't a place anymore. It was a trap. "You're one of us now," the driver whispered. "Welcome to the loop." I tried jumping out while the car moved. I braced myself and flung the door open, but instead of falling onto a road, I landed in my old bedroom. Everything was just as I left it. Messy bed posters, my phone buzzing on the desk. I sighed in relief and laughed. Was it just a dream? I checked the date on my phone. It had been years since I took the cab. I ran to the mirror. My reflection was me again, but in its hand, it held a taximeter. It was still spinning behind me. The honk of a cab echoed. I turned slowly. The yellow cab was parked in my room, and the driver was waiting. He stepped out, smiling now, with fully black eyes and a badge that said, "Final fare time's up," he said. I screamed and threw things at him, books, lamps, even my phone, but nothing touched him. He walked through the furniture like a shadow. I bolted down the hallway out of the house, but my street was gone. Just more cornfields, enter rows of people stepping into yellow cabs. All of them had the same driver. All of them looked like me. I fell to my knees. I looked at my arm, the skin now red driver. I wasn't the passenger anymore, was becoming the next driver, and my cab was waiting. The sky above me cracked like glass as I stepped toward the idling taxi. My body moved, but it wasn't me controlling it anymore. Every step echoed as if the ground were hollow. The cab door creaked open, and I slid inside, this time into the driver's seat. My hands gripped the wheel, numb, unfamiliar in the rearview mirror. A new face sat in the back seat, pale, confused, just like I had looked. He leaned forward, voice trembling. "A two-way drive, please." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The taxi shifted into gear on its own. My reflection blinked even though I didn't. We drove into a fog that didn't exist seconds ago. That's when I saw it, a strange book, resting on the passenger seat. The rules of the road. I opened the book, each page made of old leathery skin, stitched with black thread. The rules were burned in, not written. Rule 1, pick up only those the cab chooses. Rule 2, never talk to them after midnight. Rule 3, do not take detours unless the cab forces you. Rule 4, if the passenger asks your name, lie. Rule 5, never under any circumstance look in the rearview mirror after the fare begins. My skin crawled. The last rule had no number, just one word: run. I looked in the rearview mirror out of reflex. My mistake. The passenger's face was gone. In its place was a black void. From it came a whisper. "We're inside you now." The cab started, shaking violently. The road fractured and rose like jagged bone. I tried to stop, to brake, to scream, but nothing worked. The taxi climbed the impossible incline toward a glowing red gate in the sky behind me. The void filled the back seat, stretching forward, fingers of shadow coiling around my neck. "You drove too far. It said you broke too many rules." I gasped for air as the gate opened, revealing 1,000 faces screaming, stitched into the sky like stars. One of them was my mother's, another was mine. The cab saw through, and suddenly, silence. I opened my eyes. I was back at the station again, dawn rising, everything normal had I imagined it all. The diner, the mirror, the stitched skin. My breath was shaky as I stood up. The cab was gone, just a lonely road and birds chirping in the distance. My phone buzzed. I had signal again. I dialed my cousin Hart, still racing. "Hey, you coming?" he asked. "You've been gone for days." But it had only been an hour. I walked toward the road, confused, and spotted a cab pulling up. Not yellow. This one was red. The driver looked exactly like me. Smiled. "Need a lift?" I turned and ran, but the road looped behind me. I was trapped. Again, I stumbled into a small gas station at the edge of the woods, panting. The cashier stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. "You came back?" he whispered. Nodded, breathless. He handed me a box without explanation. Inside was a key. "Metal, cold, old, there's only one way out." He said, "The old road behind the cemetery. It's not on any map." I took the key and ran past twisted trees and fields where no corn should grow. I found the dirt. Road trembling. A rusted taxi sat at the edge, engine rumbling like a growl. Unlocked the trunk. Inside was the original driver, still breathing, eyes wide, mouth sewn shut. He mouthed something desperately I couldn't read. His lips, but I understood. "Kill me." Behind me, the sound of tires on gravel. Another cab. Another version of me stepped out. "It's always been us," he said. "We're the fuel." I looked at the Stitch driver, then the clone, then the open cab. "You can end this," the clone said, "but only if you choose to take the final ride." I lit a match, threw it into the open tank. The taxi burst into flame, and with it the loop began to break all around. I heard screeches like tires and dying animals as the flames devoured the cab. The Stitch driver let out a muffled scream, his body twisting unnaturally before vanishing into thin air like smoke being sucked into another realm. The doppelganger version of me stood there motionless, as if waiting for the fire to make its final decision. But instead of burning, he began to laugh, a dry, hollow sound that echoed in all directions. His skin cracked like porcelain, revealing hundreds of tiny blinking eyes beneath the surface. "Burning the car doesn't end it," he said, voice doubling over itself like a broken cassette tape. "You lit the match. Now you drive the truth. My legs gave out. I collapsed onto the gravel, unable to breathe, watching as every shadow around me started slithering toward the wreck. The fire didn't spread. It concentrated, glowing brighter, hotter, until it exploded into a burst of white light, and then everything went black. I woke up weeks later in a hospital bed in rural Chicago. A sheriff said I was found unconscious near an abandoned service. Road my cousin visited, saying I'd missed Thanksgiving. I smiled, pretending I remembered none of it, but I did every second, every whisper, every rule I left. Town a week later and never looked back, but sometimes at night when the wind is just right, I still hear the faint ding of a taximeter. Once a letter came in. The mail, no return address inside, was a badge, my badge driver, and scribbled on the back in red ink, "The road is never closed. We're always hiring." Story 4. It wasn't just raining, it was like the sky was bleeding black. Water thick and syrupy, falling in slow, suffocating sheets. Each drop slapped the ground like wet flesh, and the air smelled like rotting leaves and rusted metal. I was stranded in a forgotten stretch of rural Chicago where the streetlights flickered like dying fireflies, and the buildings looked abandoned decades ago. My phone wouldn't turn on, even the clock on it spun wildly like it had lost its mind. The trees lining the road didn't sway. They loomed, their branches hanging low like skeletal arms waiting to grab. Then out of the sludge of rain and shadow, a pair of headlights buzzed to life just ahead, dim and trembling, as if unsure whether they should exist. A taxi rolled forward, slow and heavy, its tires squelching in the oily puddles.